Fungus gnats are extremely common insects that occur outdoors in a variety of environments where they feed on decaying plant matter and fungi. Normally they're not observed, but where they intersect in humans and draw attention to themselves are usually in indoor growing situations, in house plants or bedding plants being grown in a greenhouse. The kinds of problems and concerns that arise with them is often just that they're a nuisance. They develop in soil of plants, and the adults move about the room from that point and maybe get into food or skip across the newspaper or the book you're reading, collect around the window. And they can be a significant nuisance problem. They also can do some plant injury. Although the larvae are mostly feeding on fungi, they will occasionally feed on roots. And under certain circumstances where you have moist soils and there are pathogens that can cause root decay, then the wounds that are made by the fungus gnat larvae might increase the amount of root rotting fungi that occur with the plants. Fungus gnats are tiny little gnats. They're tiny. They're flies that kind of have a general appearance more like a mosquito, but are quite small. They can fly, but they usually only make short flights, kind of little skipping, jerky little flights, maybe a couple inches at a time, but can be quite active. The appearance is more or less like a miniature mosquito, and they're probably most easily seen when they're arrested and trapped on a sticky card, which is often used to monitor the populations of fungus gnats as well as other insects that might be on indoor plants such as thrips or aphids or whiteflies. The life cycle is fairly straightforward. It's typical of an insect in the order Diptera, the flies. The adults are going to lay eggs. The eggs hatch. You have larvae that feed on fungi and occasionally on the roots. When they are finished developing, they become a pupa also within the soil, and then the adults emerge. The adult is not a very long live stage. They may only live 4 or 5 days, maybe a week at most. And during this time, the female will lay eggs in small batches in little cracks and crevices on the surface of the soil. The larvae that hatch from these eggs then develop within the soil, again, mostly feeding on fungi. And in about 3 to 4 weeks, they'll become full grown and then pupate. The fungus gnat larvae are not particularly conspicuous kind of insect. They're fairly translucent in their body form. They do have a distinctly dark head. One way that is fairly simple to monitor for fungus gnat larvae or to determine the presence or if there's any changes in their abundance is just simply putting a potato slice in the soil of a plant that you wish to check, and check it in 48 hours and see if any are attached to the potato slice. It works very well as a monitoring tool for the larval stages. In this case, you've got a fungus gnat larva on this potato slice, a little out of focus in the upper part of this picture, but also show that you can get some other things if you use that potato slice trick. In this case, there's some springtails that are indicated in the lower left of the picture. So, fungus gnat control can be approached from a couple different ways, but probably most important is water management. Situations where fungus gnats increase in high numbers, where they could be doing significant damage, usually involve soils that are continuously wet or almost always continuously wet. And one of the ways to reduce their buildup of populations is to allow the plants to dry out between watering to some degree, not keeping them constantly moist. And that can greatly retard the successful development. It also retards the growth of fungi in which they're feeding. Another thing to consider is if you have any sources of decaying vegetation, maybe some plant material that you had discarded and was lying on the floor of a greenhouse. That could be a source of very large numbers of fungus gnats, so you would want to eliminate these as well. There are some biological controls that are used for fungus gnats, particularly in situations like a greenhouse where plants are being grown over a long period of time. These include some predators, includes nematodes, and a pathogen can be used as well. The predator that is sometimes used for fungus gnats is a kind of mite, a predatory mite, Stratiolaelaps simitus. Used to go under a different scientific name, Hypoaspis milis. This is a mite that lives in the soil. It's a generalist predator. It'll feed on fungus gnat larvae. It'll feed on thrips pupae. It'll feed on springtails, pretty much whatever it can overcome. And these are an organism that are fairly widely available in the trade. Bacillus thuringiensis is the bacterium that has the most wide use for insect control. Lots of different strains of Bacillus thuringiensis. Original strains were used to control various kinds of caterpillars in the order Lepidoptera. But there are multiple strains, and one of these, Israelensis strain, is effective against certain kinds of flies that are in the group that includes fungus gnats, also includes mosquitoes and black flies. So there are several kinds of products you can buy that has the Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis in it. There are commercial products such as Natrol. Knocks out gnats is a popular formula, and most widely available is mosquito bits. These are now most recently have been labeled for use on fungus gnats. These would all be used either as a drench or sprinkled on the surface and watered in, and then the developing fungus gnat larvae, were they to eat the bacterium, would be killed. Also, insect parasitic nematodes are used for control of fungus gnat larvae and some other soil-dwelling insects in pots. And these are nematodes that develop within insects, releasing a bacterium into the susceptible insect and then developing on the insect after it has been killed. The specific kind of insect parasitic nematode most widely used for fungus gnat control is Steinonema feltii, and it is used again as a soil drench. It would be a mixture of these nematodes, and they would move through the soil, and you would hope that they would successfully invade the body of a fungus gnat larva. There are also several kinds of insecticides that can be used. The most commonly available for most people would be either a imidacloprid, which is a systemic insecticide that works way into the soil, or some of the neem products that contain the active ingredient azadirachtin, something like ornazine or azatin or bioneem. These also would be used as a soil drench, and the neem products work by inhibiting the proper growth of the fungus gnat larvae. They are an insect growth regulator. Fungus gnats are the most common kind of small kind of fly that you will find coming out of a pot or in a greenhouse operation. But if you do have a greenhouse, you might see some other kinds of flies. Shore flies, less commonly drain flies, and every once in a while the humpback flies. But the most common ones that are sometimes seen in greenhouses anyways would be shore flies. They're a larger fly. The shore fly here is on the left, fungus gnats on the right, and they are also common outdoors as well, where they're most frequently seen around the shores of lakes. And that's because the food of shore flies is algae. They are sometimes obvious in a greenhouse because one aspect of their behavior is that when they defecate, they leave little fly specks. So you might see little spots on pots or on flowers, and that's a symptom of shore flies, something that's very different from fungus gnats. You not see any kind of markings like that. So fly specks, if you have a situation with fly specks in a greenhouse, that's related to shore flies. And the food that they're feeding on is algae. Algae would be growing in sites that are wetted continuously over a long period of time, and if you wish to get rid of shore flies, then managing algae is the way to handle this problem. So that's the most common other fly one might find in a greenhouse, and it's important to know that it is a very different insect than the fungus gnats. There's a couple different differences in their behavior and how you might manage them. So for fungus gnats, they're feeding on fungi, which would be in the soil. In the case of shore flies, it would be algae. So if you do things to reduce the food of either or both of those, that's how you're going to get some management. Fly specks are only being produced by the shore flies. And that Bacillus thuringiensis product, the BT israelensis strain, only works against fungus gnats. It doesn't work on the kinds of flies that include the shore flies. There are other kinds of flies occasionally you might find in a larger greenhouse operation. There's a curious kind of fly called the moth fly that looks like a very tiny little moth. They're also known as drain flies because they are often associated with drains, and in particular the bacterial slime that often grows on a drain where there's continuously wet, often with a nutrient-rich water, maybe some fertilizer going into the drain. So moth flies, where they'd be coming from would be a drain or some area where there's bacterial growth, and if you wish to eliminate those, you would manage that site. These do not have any effect on plants. You would not find these associated with houseplants. And then occasionally you'll also find what are called humpback flies in a greenhouse or similar site. These are associated also with moist organic matter, often in drains as well. So this wouldn't be the bacterial slime, but if there was some food particles or other material that tended to get caught in a drain, this is the kind of material they'd be feeding on. But again, humpback flies don't have the association with the plants that the fungus gnats do. So I think that about wraps up these little flies that you might see associated with houseplants or in greenhouses.